MacDonald writes, the church upheld the apostolic witnesses in its sacred literature as a way of grounding its faith in Jesus, represented by the apostles' teaching and ensuring that the church tradition was not severed from its historical roots and proximity to Jesus, the primary authority of the early church. He adds, if it was believed that an apostle wrote a particular book, that writing was accepted and treated as scripture. There is no doubt that all the books of the New Testament were placed in the canon because the majority believed that they were written by apostles or members of the apostolic community. On the day called Sunday, all who live in the cities or on the country gather together in one place, and the memoirs of the apostles or the writings of the prophets were read, as long as time permits. Then, when the reader has ceased, precedent verbally instructs and exhorts to the initiation of these good things. That's written by Justin Martyr. Ignatius, in AD, who was around from 50 to 115, after the death of Christ, indicated the difference between the importance of the writings and the writings of the apostles when he wrote in his letter to Trallians, I do not issue orders like an apostle, and nor am I such a disciple as Peter or Paul. So Bruce, another scholar, states those whose apostleship was recognized by fellow Christians were acknowledged to be Christ's agents, speaking as his authority. Young observes, another scholar, Young, the only one who speaks in the New Testament with authority that is underived and self-authenticating is the Lord. Okay, so second, the New Testament canonical books, the reason for their collection. So number one, they were prophetic. The initial reason for collecting and preserving the inspired books was that they were prophetic. That is, since they were written by apostles or prophets of God, they must be valuable. And if valuable, they should be preserved. This reasoning is apparent in apostolic times by the collection and circulation of Paul's epistles. You can see this in 2 Peter 3:15 and Colossians 4:16. Second, the needs of the early church. So the church needed to know which books should be read, revered, and applied to their varied and often precarious situations in a generally hostile and social religious environment. They had many problems to address, and they needed assurance regarding which books would serve as their source of authority. Okay, so 3, the rise of heretics. When the heretic Marcion published a sharply abridged list of canonical books, and he did this in 140 AD, the need for a complete canonical list became really serious, because we've got guys coming around saying all kinds of different things. So in 4, the circulation of spurious writings. This is the 4th reason. Many churches used apocryphal books and services. Many churches in the East, for example, Alexandria and Egypt, were reading certain books of the New Testament Apocrypha. There's a whole section on the Apocrypha in their public services. Clearly, a decision needed to be made as to exactly which books were to be included in the canon. And 5, missions. Christianity had spread rapidly to other countries, and there was a need to translate the Bible into those other languages. As early as the first half of the 2nd century, the Bible was translated into Syriac and Old Latin. But because the missionaries could not translate a Bible that did not exist, attention was necessarily drawn to the question of which books really belonged to the authoritative Christian canon. 6, persecution. The Edict of Diocletian in AD 303 called for the destruction of the sacred books of the Christians, who would die for a book that was perhaps religious but not sacred. Christians needed to know which books were truly sacred. MacDonald writes that the Edict of Diocletian caused the church to make conscious decisions about what literature it considered sacred. The Christians tried to salvage as much of their sacred literature as possible by turning over to them less important texts that were not considered sacred. Okay, the canon was recognized. So Polycarp, this isn't a historian who was around at the time, Polycarp and his contemporaries. Polycarp, who was around in AD 115, Clement of Alexandria around at AD 200, and other early Christian fathers refer to the Old and New Testament books with this phrase, as it is said in these scriptures. It's important. Justin Martyr. Justin Martyr was around between 100 and 165 AD. He writes in his first apology, and on the day called Sunday, all who live in the cities and the countries would gather together in one place, and the memoirs of the apostles and the writings of the prophets were read as long as time permits. Irenaeus was another contemporary guy. Considering the significance of Irenaeus, who was around 180 AD, Bruce, another scholar, writes the importance of evidence lies in his link with the apostolic age and his ecumenical associations brought up in Asia Minor at the feet of Polycarp, the disciple of John. He became Bishop of Lyons in Gaul, and his writings attest to the canonical recognition of the fourfold Gospels and Acts of Romans 1 and 2, Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians 1 and 2, Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, and Titus, Peter, 1 Peter, 1 John, and Revelation. In his treaty against heresies, it is evident that by AD 180, the idea of the fourfold gospel had become so axiomatic, that's just standard, so that means throughout Christendom, that it could be referred to as an established fact, as obvious and inevitable and natural as the four cardinal points of the compass, north, south, east, and west, as we call them, or the four winds, and that is Muratorian fragment. So Bruce writes that the Muratorian fragment, an early list of New Testament books drawn up in the church at Rome towards the end of the 2nd century, is called the Muratorian fragment. The fragment is mutilated at the beginning, but seems to have mentioned Matthew and Mark, because it goes on to mention Luke as the third gospel, then it mentions John. The fragment also mentions the Acts, the epistles of Paul, Jude, 1st and 2nd John, and the general epistles, and 2 Revelations, those of John and Peter. Some did not want the latter to be read in the church, he says. He recommends the reading of the Shepherd of Hermas in private, and lists the Wisdom of Solomon missing. So these are some of the books they decided not to include: the Wisdom of Solomon, Shepherd of Hermas, and they said just read these books, but they're not to be read out loud in the church. Missing are 1st and 2nd Peter, Hebrews, 3 John, and James. So some scholars date the original text of the Muratorian fragment near or before the end of the late 2nd century, and claim that it was written in the vicinity of Rome on the basis of internal evidence. Other scholars feel that, among other reasons, since there are no parallels to the Muratorian fragment until the Eusebius, the document should probably be dated sometime after the mid to 4th century. Kruger comments on the date of the fragment, and he says this: however, largely overlooked in this discussion and many other discussions like it is the list of books offered by Origen, Origen, more than half century earlier than suggested later date of the fragment. Okay, so first glance, Origen appears to offer a complete list of New Testament books that is nearly the same as the 27-book canon eventually affirmed by the later church. If so, then it has the potential to challenge the suggestion that the 4th century is the first time the church fathers were concerned about limiting the boundaries of the New Testament canon. Well, hey guys, thanks so much for watching this video. I am so excited that you stuck to it to the end, and I appreciate that. And please do smack that subscribe button. Check out the next video.